This presentation on military training of remote viewing skills by telling you who I am and why it is that I'm going to be telling you all of this. Then we'll cover some of the background of the Army remote viewing effort. Then I'm going to actually go into the behaviors and skills training that was used by the military, which included the behaviors of letting go and turning inward, resonance and contact with the remote viewing site, a listening behavior, then a becoming aware behavior, and finally describing and reporting the information perceived. Let's go back to the 1970s and get started here. In the early 1970s, the CIA funded the research in remote viewing. Their mission was to scientifically examine the intelligence implications of remote viewing. You see, the CIA had collected information around the world about the Soviet and East Europeans doing millions of dollars of research every single year on psychic functioning, and it was concerning intelligence applications because it was funded by the KGB. Now, it's very difficult to find out what the results of their actual tests were, at least back in the 1970s. The CIA paid U.S. researchers, specifically Stanford Research Institute, to duplicate the research projects to find out what results might be. And so their contracts with Stanford Research International involved some well-known psychics, well-known today, Ingo Swann and Pat Price, among others. Moving forward in time to the late 1970s, the U.S. Army became interested in remote viewing because we were presented with a question in security of how do we protect ourselves from this Soviet remote viewing. If the Soviets do have a program, an intelligence program in remote viewing, how we're supposed to protect ourselves from this. So I came up with the notion of training remote viewers, training them, and then assessing the security threat posed by remote viewing surveillance. I was in the U.S. Army, so this became a U.S. Army INSCOM, Intelligence and Security Command, and SRI program. It was called Project Grill Flame initially, and of course when it was finally canceled in 1995, it was called Project Stargate, and that's the way most people know the unclassified program now. So back in the era of the late 70s, I became the operations and training officer of this unique Army remote viewing unit. What did that entail? Taken from my official DA Form 67-8, as the operations officer, I was going to actually run intelligence programs, satisfy intelligence collection requirements using remote viewers. On the training side of the house, I was responsible for training individuals in this unique special intelligence collection technique and maintaining a level of the state-of-art of training. This is a very classified program, specialized program, and I was included in a special personnel program, the Great Skills program, so that I might be able to stay with this assignment for a prolonged period of time and not move from Army assignment to Army assignment like other officers did. So let's take a deeper look at how this all came about, how I developed a training program. Since SRI was under contract, I first went out to SRI to discover what it is that they were doing with remote viewers out at SRI. I asked them how we might be able to train remote viewers and tell me a little bit about the remote viewers that they had. They didn't know whether you could train a remote viewer or not, but they were enthusiastic about the idea, thought it would be a neat thing to do. They said that their remote viewers were simply encouraged to draw or to sketch or to say 2 or 3 words about a perceived target. They didn't have any other guidelines or structure other than just getting into a room where they were left alone and asked the viewer to describe the site designated and perhaps sketch a little bit. When I asked them about particular techniques of remote viewing or particular styles or personality types, they really didn't have much to offer. They said that they didn't feel that there was any particular way or behavior or special state of consciousness that was conducive to remote viewing. They were, in fact, physicists, and what they tried to do is just set up circumstances where a person could perform remote viewing, and they would allow that person to do whatever behavior seemed appropriate. So I went on and looked in different organizations to find out what they were doing in remote viewing, and I researched the activities at the Psychophysical Research Laboratory, and they had a little different approach to remote viewing, a little different understanding. They felt that this very low-level psychic impression comes below our normal conscious awareness, that everyday life kind of screens out our perceptions of these very quiet psychic signals. And so they thought that if they could neutralize our physical senses, sort of disregard the outside world, that they might allow these rather quiet signals to come into our awareness. Now they proposed a method for doing that, to neutralize this, which they called the Ganzfeld. In this technique, the idea was to screen out the outside world, to neutralize the outside world, to quiet one's mind. But this wasn't limited to Chuck Honorton and other Ganzfeld researchers. This was the cornerstone of many traditional and Eastern meditation techniques to kind of separate yourself from the outside world. In looking elsewhere, I found that William Broad theorized a psi-conducive syndrome, a set of circumstances that really helped people perform psychically, and that would include, of course, remote viewing. This included a physical relaxed state, which we've discussed already, and a receptive attitude, a receptive internal perceptual processes. Other researchers have called this a twilight state of consciousness and connected with a brainwave theta state. He also thought that we ought to have some sort of a quiet environment, somewhat like the Ganzfeld researchers, but rather than use earphones with sound and something covering the eyes, he thought that maybe just a quiet place or quiet room to cut down on the noise. He also brought up the topic that the psychic task has to be important to the viewer. It can't be just the 300th card guessing game. It has to have some importance to the remote viewer. And that was all part of the psi-conducive syndrome that he came up with. We also studied the work of Stephen Schwartz, who used psychics, remote viewers out in the field, and was able to elicit information from them in a remarkable way. In looking at everything that I had read, everybody I'd talked to, it made sense that you had to kind of quiet your mind, alter your state of consciousness in some way to be able to do this thing called remote viewing. Having had personal experience in this, I remember as a kid working on cars that I could just think about a car and I could sort of like X-ray vision see inside the car, see what was wrong with it, and then I could proceed to take it apart and fix it. And for a long time I thought this is what mechanics did when you took a car to a mechanic, but in my adult life I learned later that this is not what a mechanic does. I also saw this experience that I was having as being a twofold dynamic, a first case experience and a second case experience. In the first case, I was immersed in the activity, actually deeply involved in whatever I was perceiving. But in the second case, I suddenly became aware, sort of separate from it, aware that I was doing this other thing. So it was as though when I would look at an automobile, I was absorbed and involved in the looking, and then later, in a second case situation, I would think about what I perceived, what I saw, and what meaning it had. So I saw this as a twofold process, at least by my own experience. By putting together my visit with Puthoff and Targ and a review of the literature and the other researchers, and my own personal experience, I began to form some sort of a remote viewing training plan. And it's from this perspective, way back in 1977, that I developed the Army's remote viewing training program. This was a very patriotic thing for me, because if my remote viewing training program was successful, we would be able to assess the security threat posed by hostile intelligence services using remote viewing surveillance. In my training program, I adopted a behaviorist approach because I had a graduate education in counseling psychology and was somewhat of a behaviorist myself. Surely remote viewing could be divided into discrete behaviors, and then those behaviors trained using conventional learning techniques. The first of these behaviors has to do with letting go and turning inward, focusing your intention inward. It seemed to me that the act of remote viewing depended upon some sort of an interior perceptual state. It isn't as though you are opening your eyes and looking at something in the distance. It's find that information inside yourself. This reorientation of perception, this turning inward, can be brought about by several means. You can modify your body posture, lay down, get relaxed, or you can do certain things that become habits for you, that turns on this behavior of letting go and turning inward. One of SRI's famous remote viewers, Hella Hammond, had some remote viewing socks, and she would put on these socks, and that would trigger this behavior of letting go and turning inward. Pat Price, another famous remote viewer from SRI, had a pair of glasses that he would reach down and put on when he would do his remote viewing. It was like this little behavior switch that he would do to turn inward, to let go of the outside world and turn inward. Later, Ingo Swann developed the coordinate remote viewing method, and he had people put their pen down on the paper to turn on or turn off this letting go and turning inward behavior. This state of turning inward may be accessed through different processes as well that we haven't talked about. Gene Lessman taught a concept of thinking about a sanctuary, a mental landscape that you thought about as being your sanctuary. And it was from there, from first obtaining this mental perspective of your sanctuary, this mental realm, that you then jumped off into the remote viewing process. Can you force yourself into this? Can you force yourself into letting go and turning inward? Not really. It's something that you have to allow to happen rather than force yourself into. Once you get into that, however, your perception, your idea of who and what you are changes. Under a normal situation, we integrate our sensual input from our five senses. We integrate our sensual input and define for ourselves mentally who we are, what we're doing, where we are, and so forth. This is called sensory integration. But in remote viewing, your first behavior is to let go and turn inward, and you become aware of all of time and space. So how do you define for yourself? What is your personal space, your personal identity, if you can perceive beyond the body? So there's a very interesting shift in awareness that takes place here. In this mental state, there is a change. There's a mental calmness. There's not the cacophony and mental chatter that normally goes on in the mind. Things seem to slow down. The transformation from our normal mental processes seems to turn to our autonomic nervous system. Ingo Swann talked about this in terms of our whole body system, and talked about how the remote viewing perception impacts this system, and we have to detect and decode our autonomic nervous system for the information that it now knows. The characteristics of this initial remote viewing state are also common to the twilight state that has been identified by other researchers, this internal state of calm. This letting go and turning inward seems to be something that's learnable. Once you experience it and realize that that's the state that you're after, you can learn how to get back there. It's like shooting a basketball. Once you learn how to stand, how to push your arms forward, how to focus on the hoop, once you learn that, then you can return to that behavior. So this state of inner calm, this letting go and turning inward, is something that's learnable. Also, once you have learned how to do this, you can perpetuate this state. You know when you fall out of it, you know how to get back into it. You can perpetuate this. Teaching this, teaching somebody how to understand what this is, involves teaching how to relax and turn inward. There are methods that you can do this. There are concepts like yoga, concepts like meditation that address this issue. I set up reinforcement scenarios like you might do in a sports situation. There are ways to teach people how to shoot baskets. You set up a situation conducive to that. I provided these trainees with different materials and asked them to try out yoga, try transcendental meditation, try biofeedback, try the hemisync technique from the Monroe Institute, all with the concept of teaching yourself only one thing, teaching yourself how to relax and turn inward. Let's look at the second behavior, the resonance phase, or getting in contact with the site. I emphasize here information of interest because there's quite a bit difference between military operational remote viewing and laboratory evaluation of remote viewing. In a laboratory evaluation, you might have a particular site and identify particular characteristics that would identify statistically that the remote viewer accurately described that site. In operational remote viewing, you're more interested in a particular piece of information. If you were asking a remote viewer, for example, to remote view an airport, if he came back and described runways and airplanes, from the laboratory remote viewing point of view, he might get a very high score. But from an operational point of view, if you're looking to see whether or not there is a terrorist bomb on one of the airplanes, him coming back and telling you this is an airport with airplanes is of little value in terms of information of interest. So there's quite a difference between military operational remote viewing and laboratory investigation of remote viewing. The types of questions that you can ask a remote viewer seem to be limitless. You need to operate with remote viewing as though there are no limitations. There's nothing, no piece of information that the remote viewer cannot contact in some way. However, it can be difficult to stimulate that contact. It behooves the operations officer in military remote viewing to be very clever in the way he asks questions of the remote viewer in order to extract the information of interest. The process of connecting appears to emerge from the unconscious. People are different. But it's not appropriate in training to say to a person, your style is wrong, you shouldn't do it that way, there's a better way to do this. What you need to do is to very gently coach and reinforce an individual's preferred style and hone that style to its logical perfection. Some people are going to think about this as bringing the information into their own interior mental space that has been freed up because of their relaxation in turning inward. Others are going to think about this in terms of extending their awareness, their perception of the world to include the remote viewing target. They consider this to be a no space-time universe, so they ought to be able to extend their consciousness across all space and time. There's another view that perhaps you could tune into or resonate with the information of interest, and from there the target becomes part of who and what you are. You are at one with the target, and therefore you can simply describe yourself. It becomes a process of internal exploration when you see it this way. Teaching this contact behavior simply means that you'd have to pay attention to each individual's technique, each individual's style, and gently reinforce those elements of that style that provide for beneficial information. Imagine for a moment that you're going to teach someone how to play soccer. You're going to teach a little kid how to play soccer, how to connect with the soccer ball. The first thing you would do is to put the ball down right at their feet and have them kick the ball. And the better they do at kicking the ball, the more you tell them, oh, that's a terrific job, you did a great job there. And you might suggest, maybe point the toe or bend a knee. But generally speaking, what you're going to do is simply reward them when they have really good contact with the ball. And then you begin to make the task a little bit more difficult. You gently roll the ball at them and ask them to kick it again. Then you get them to move themselves, to approach the ball themselves and try kicking it. The teaching job here, the coaching job here, is simply to present a variety of opportunities, progressively more and more difficult, to get contact with the ball. Their experience, their first-person experience of actually contacting the ball, is going to be based on what you tell them, as well as some internal self-reinforced behavior. They are going to build on their first-person experience, building up their own confidence. How do you do that? Through trial and error, by repeated practice, by your rewarding them, by them kicking the ball. They learn during this process. You might tell them that to visualize their foot kicking the ball, or others might like to see themselves flying across the field with the ball. Now, this isn't unusual at all. I mean, visualization in sports has become quite the thing. And in psychotherapy now, they're using virtual reality to have people visualize anxiety situations as part of their psychotherapy. In training this contacting behavior, it's best to start off with a small step-by-step procedure. Just like you did in the case of teaching the kid to play soccer, you're going to get progressively more difficult, more challenging situations. And one of the best ways to start with remote viewing is in the simple SRI outbounder protocol. In this protocol, you would meet Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, and then at the designated time, you would be taken off to a room, a sequestered room, with Russell Targ. And Hal Puthoff would go off towards some undisclosed location, approximately 30 minutes from the SRI headquarters in Menlo Park. You, back in the room with Russell Targ, would be asked to describe Dr. Puthoff's current location. You had no way of knowing, other than remote viewing, where that might be. After this procedure, after you described the location, you were then taken out to the location so that you might review your perceptions and validate the accuracies and inaccuracies of your behavior. When you do this several times, you begin to learn from your natural adaptation what are successful modus operandi, successful mental processes which gave you correct information and those which did not. So this original SRI protocol is a very easy thing to do. I mean, it's quite easy to imagine that you are, perhaps seeing through the eyes of Dr. Puthoff, or describing his behavior there. One could conceivably think of themselves as being part of the target itself and becoming one with the site. People use different modes, and one is not better than the other. And in training, what you have to do is simply reinforce the appropriate mode. Reinforce those behaviors within that perceptual mode which yield the best results. Making these steps progressively more difficult then, a little bit different operation would be to have someone describe a picture in a concealed envelope, or the physical place on the planet that's depicted in the picture in the envelope. This is a little different because the feedback is going to be less. In the first case, you actually physically went to the site as your feedback, walked around the location, really became part of what it was. In this case, you're only going to get to look at the picture in the envelope as your feedback. So, in a way, it's making the task a little bit more difficult. And once this is mastered, then you can move on to even more difficult situations. You can provide geographic coordinates as a cue. So the trainee remote viewer says, well, look, I could tell you where Dr. Puthoff was because he's a human being and I met him and I can sort of understand how to do that. And yes, I was able to do the thing in the envelope because, I knew that I would be getting to see the picture. There was physically an envelope and I understood what the task was. But how in the world can I describe someplace on the planet based on geographic coordinates? I have no idea. Well, that's the point. You're not supposed to have any idea. You're supposed to remote view it. And so as the person does this again and again, repeated practice, just like teaching someone how to play soccer, more and more difficult tasks and repeated practice. Pretty soon, they become proficient and they grow in their own self-confidence that they can do this. The coach praises evidence of strong contact with the target so that the remote viewer internalizes those processes which are successful. Let's turn now to the third behavior that I identified, that of listening. We're not actually teaching this remote viewing package all at one big time here. What we're talking about is teaching, first of all, the concept of relaxing and turning inward. The second behavior of how to connect with the target. And now that we're connected with the target, what we're going to do here is listen. And the word listen is only a metaphor here. It's not as though you're going to use your ears. What I'm talking about is paying attention to your internal perceptual processes. Paying attention to what's going on inside you. And you might find many things in there. The information comes first through habits that we've developed. In our brain, this wet system that we have inside our cranium, there are neural pathways that are well used and provide us with answers to the questions of, what is this? What's it for? What does it mean to me? And those are all ego-based concepts, and those are well entrenched within our neural networks. Those are the first kinds of responses that are likely to come up because they're habits. And viewers themselves have different habits. They characteristically perceive things differently. We know from NLP that some people talk about things in terms of, that sounds right to me. Others say, that looks good. And others will tell you, oh, it just feels right. So there are many different ways in which we process this information. The remote viewer's attention, in fact, might be internal or external, or even could be panoramic in a wide parameter. But it's usually not focused on any one particular thing. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of focused attention. When I get a letter in the mail and I open it up and I start reading that letter, that is focused attention. I'm sort of tuned out the surrounding world while I am reading that letter. That's very different than remote viewing. In remote viewing, our attention is open and ambient and not focused on one particular thing. And it is a waiting patiently, without expecting any particular thing, just waiting for the perceptions to emerge. And how do you train this? How do you train someone to listen? First of all, let's remember that this is a point in time for the remote viewer where he's not expected to report anything or say anything. That would be a second case experience, which we're going to talk about later. This involves observation of self, observation of your own mental behaviors. So we want to coach the individual to do this listening experience without reporting anything. Just observe what's going on inside yourself. After a few minutes of silence, then, the trainee is asked to describe not their actual perceptions, but the mental experience that they're having while observing. At first, the tendency for a new remote viewer is to start describing the sight and telling you what they've been listening to. But that's not what you want to happen in this stage of training. At this stage of training, you want them to describe their cognitive process. Describe this concept of listening. Sometimes you have to have people practice this over and over again because they really quickly jump to sight descriptions. They need to slow down a little bit in training. They need to describe, identify what it's like to be listening so that we can be sure that it's appropriate. Now, one of the things you can do here is to have them write essays about this process. Now, after they do 2 or 3 essays, they get the idea, I'm going to have to pay attention to what's going on because I have to write an essay about it later. So as they move into the next remote viewing exercise, they are really paying attention so that they'll be able to write their essay. Self-examination of this listening behavior. So let's go on then to the 4th behavior, becoming aware of the information. This is different from listening. Listening is calm, relaxed, open attention. Becoming aware is a different behavior altogether. And we might think of becoming aware as an aha moment. And yet, this moment is involved with several different things going on simultaneously. So let's pull apart this moment. Let's pull this moment apart and talk about that fringe area just before awareness, what's going on behaviorally during awareness, and that little fringe area of immediately after, just before awareness. Remember, we've got this person relaxed, contact with the sight, listening, and then awareness emerges. And just on this borderline, just before awareness emerges, there's a magical moment where you forget you are confined to your body. You forget where or when or who you are, ever so briefly. And suddenly, the information appears in awareness. Suddenly, in this dissociative flash, there is awareness of something while you've been listening all this time. Now, this information that you become aware of can be in many different forms. And remember, because this is right on the fringe or the cusp here, you drift back and forth between this pre-awareness and the awareness. Back and forth, drifting slightly back and forth. You might become aware of images, feelings, words, thoughts, drifting back and forth between contact with the sight, dissociation, and awareness. But if you've gone through the process correctly, if you have gone through letting go and turning inward, contacting the sight, listening, if you've gone through the steps appropriately, there's a sense of surety, a feeling of knowingness about this information. This mode of behaviors, this mode of simultaneous behaviors of becoming aware, the moment of awareness, includes an internal state that is very passive. It's important that it not be a proactive state where a viewer is wondering, I wonder if there is a car on the other side of that building, and he moves into that. I'm going to go find out if there's a car on the other side of the building. That would be a proactive state as opposed to a passive state. Now, to support that, if you're working with an interviewer, the interviewer shouldn't ask, look on the other side of the building and see if there's a car there, because that would be too proactive. The interviewer should ask, describe the other side of the building. All preconceived concepts about what the target is, what you think the target is, have to be set aside in this moment of awareness. You can't be thinking, listen, the last 3 remote viewing sites I had were islands in the middle of the ocean, so this one surely can't be an island. You have to not allow that mentation. You have to set aside any expectations. And again, I want to remind you that during this transition time, just before and just approaching, just getting involved in the becoming aware, there's a sensation of separation from your identity, a letting go of this ego state. Many of these perceptions that you're going to have are right on the fringe of becoming aware, and they aren't complete, total packages of information. For example, you might have a fleeting impression of a red brick structure. That's an indistinct or vague impression. You don't know at this point, you haven't perceived at this point, whether that brick structure is a wall, whether that brick structure is a building, or whether that brick structure is a roadway. All you know, all you've experienced in becoming aware, all that you are aware of is a red brick structure. Research has shown that we really know this information, but on an unconscious level. There have been numerous experiments done with physiological tests, monitoring such things as brain waves or galvanic skin response, that reveal that an individual at some level is aware of the psychic information. They just cannot process it or become aware of it on a conscious level. So adapting the attitude that the remote viewer knows the target, they just are not aware of it yet, is the proper attitude. Ingo had this same concept in his training when he talked about the autonomic nervous system. If the psychic signal impacted the autonomic nervous system, then you needed to detect and decode the information that has been impinged upon the autonomic nervous system. Again, let's get this down in terms of how you approach the process here. In this process of becoming aware, it is a flowing process, but understanding that you know, and the idea is to take it out of this knowingness, this unconscious realm, into conscious awareness. That is the becoming aware phase. We've talked about the moment just before, the moment during, and now let's turn to that brief period just after awareness. Because the remote viewer can do several different things. A viewer might, for example, discard the perception, either consciously or unconsciously. He might perceive a rose and say to himself in his own mental processes, oh, I gave my wife roses last night, so that's not part of this session. I won't say anything about that. Forget that rose. Alternatively, a remote viewer might grasp onto something emotionally. He might remote view a site and say, oh, well, this is so sad, this is terrible. And this is going to disturb his ability to listen to what goes on. So attaching emotions or turns off, disturbs the listening process. Now, the worst thing that can happen in this part of awareness, this just after the post-awareness phase, is that the viewer can try to recognize the target, which is not the purpose of remote viewing. In this case, the viewer might say, I see two huge inverted horseshoes, and immediately say, oh, I know what that is. That's McDonald's. Yeah, that's McDonald's. And that is going to obviously interfere with his perceptions. All of these cognitive processes, repression, attaching it to emotions, or seeking to recognize or understand the target, have the effect of trying to fix up your perceptions. And that is going to taint, is going to destroy the purity of the information. So what do we really want to do? In training this, what do we really want to encourage the remote viewer to produce? We want simply in this awareness phase, we want the remote viewer to accept the perception. That's all. Just accept and trust the perception. It's going to develop on its own. It's going to blossom on its own. The perception of a red brick structure is going to, on its own, evolve into the brick building, or the brick roadway, or the brick wall. As part of the remote viewing process, it's not necessary to repress it, to get attached to it, or to even recognize or interpret it. In teaching this unique behavior, this unique awareness behavior, it involves the trainee in reinforcing only those behaviors which provide us with the information of interest. The viewer has to be coached to maintain an open mind, not this narrow focus like reading a letter, but coached to maintain an open, broad perspective. And reactions to perceptions have to be measured. An internal mental process of monitoring your own thinking, of measured thinking, not allowing your mind to race off in old habits and the old entrenched ways. An example of this is a remote viewing done by Joe McMoneagle at Stanford Research Institute. He once came back and almost immediately told Russell Targ, it's the beach. Dr. Puthoff is at the beach. And Russell very wisely said to him, well, Joe, tell me what it is that you're perceiving that tells you that. Do you smell the ocean? Joe said, no. Well, do you hear the sound of surf? No. Do you see people in bathing suits? No. Well, Joe, what is it that you perceive about the target? Joe said, I perceive sand. There's sand here. Well, that mental type of thinking is what we're talking about disciplining. As it turns out, when they went out to the site to find out where Dr. Putoff was, he had gone to a brickyard, and there was a huge pile of sand for mixing up the mortar and so forth, and Dr. Putoff had climbed up on this pile of sand. Letting your mind run away with itself rather than maintaining a measured discipline of mental activity is going to get you in trouble. We talked about doing essays before, and in this case we want them to write an essay about this becoming aware phase. Again, what we're doing is slowing down this process so that they can become aware of what's going on in their own minds, of their own world inside them, with the goal eventually of making a good remote viewer. Note that these essays are not about what they perceive in the awareness phase, not about the target itself. It's about their own mentation, an essay about their own mentation. So in the beach example I just talked about, the essay might include, well, I perceived sand and I remembered feeling the sand underneath my feet when I went to the beach last week, and so I immediately thought, oh, this is the beach, it's just like the beach. So that's the way he would write his essay, and he would learn from that. The teacher would help, the coach would tend to reinforce and accent those behaviors, show the person through their own self-examination what were successful strategies and what were unsuccessful strategies. Let me say a little bit more about this idea of becoming aware. Again, it's not necessary to analyze or figure out at this point what those little elements are that you're perceiving during the awareness phase. As the session progresses, you're going to get deeper contact with this site, and things are going to be able to resolve themselves. This becoming aware, this extended moment that I've been explaining, is psychic or mental. It's something that's happening inside you. And it's not the same as reporting or objectifying, which we're going to talk about in a minute. This is an internal mental process, this moment of awareness that we spread out into these kind of three areas. But objectification, which we'll talk about in just a minute, can yield more information. So, for example, in the terms of the red brick structure, in the Ingo Swann training, he might have you put your pencil down on the ideogram that led you to say red brick structure, and by touching that ideogram, collect more information. Allow yourself to become even more aware of that red brick structure so that it might resolve into its true nature. That true nature being either a brick building, a brick wall, or maybe even a brick roadway. Look now at the fifth behavior, which is describing or reporting. Again, it is not the same first case behavior of becoming aware. Remember how I talked about there's this sort of immersion with the target where you're all wrapped up in the actual experience of the target itself, and then separate from that there's this experience of describing what that experience is like. So it's a second case sort of experience, different than the awareness phase. This behavior is sometimes called objectification, and that word comes from Ingo Swann, the idea of taking something out of our mental space and bringing it out into the objective world, and as Ingo said, by saying and writing this down. Remembering that there is a first stage experience, the actual awareness of the site, and the second stage experience of describing that awareness. The remote viewer is going to have to learn precise strategies to translate the impressions between awareness and what goes on with objectifying. And therein lies the dangers of blocking information, of analysis. But if the behaviors have been done, as I've explained, if you have gone through the first relaxing and letting go, if you have contacted the target, if you have listened to your internal perceptual process, if you have become aware, then you have detached from your ego during that awareness phase, and there is much less chance of getting back into the ego-based analysis of a target. Ideally, the remote viewing information is direct knowledge, and it's not embellished in any way through analysis or wondering what it is or thinking about what it might be. When the remote viewer does his job, it can be great. It can be a wonderful way of obtaining information of interest, the military information of interest that we've been talking about, information that can be obtained by no other means. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about the role of the interviewer or monitor, both during and after the time of awareness and objectifying. First of all, the attitude of the remote viewer is important, and I'm going to reiterate something I said before. The viewer knows everything about the target. The trick here is to get him to describe what he knows, to become aware in the awareness process, and to describe in the objectification what he knows. This remote viewing process then becomes a team effort at this point in time. A team effort to discover the information of interest. The interviewer has to pay attention to what's going on with this remote viewer during the becoming aware phase and the objectifying. The interviewer has to watch carefully, pay attention to what's going on. And the most effective interviewers are those that have had some intuitive experience themselves so that they understand and respect what's going on with the remote viewer. How do you train this? How do you train, being a teacher or coach, how do you train this objectification process? The purpose of the training is the skill of objectifying what you already know. Now, I realize I've said that concept many times. The skill is to teach objectifying of what you already know. Because the monitor understands the remote viewing process, the monitor helps the remote viewer in describing, in verbalizing and sketching the various aspects of the site, things that the remote viewer isn't aware that they know. The monitor watches the remote viewer's body language, listens very carefully to the phrasing, and focuses and redirects the remote viewer appropriately. Now I'm going to explore this effort slowly, a piece at a time. Reflecting back, this becoming aware and objectifying are distinctly different behaviors. And the intent to objectify shuts off or slows down a little bit the concept of acquiring information. This is a first case experience versus a second case experience. And the viewer has to learn to maintain a delicate balance between these two, and over time gets better and better at them, and they begin to merge together into one behavior. As an example of this, think about a young person learning to drive a car for the first time. A young person learning to drive a car, and they're paying attention to everything around them. What's in the rearview mirror? What's in front of them? What's to the left side? What's to the right side? How fast am I going? Where's the brake? What's this happening? It's very difficult for them to have a conversation with you in the car because their attention is so intense. But with practice and over a period of time, You can drive down the road as though it were fully automatic and carry on a conversation with the person next to you quite easily. Now, how do you get this same kind of adaptation in a remote viewer? During this process of objectification, the interviewer monitor can observe certain indications that tell you that the person is involved, that the remote viewer is involved with a first case experience rather than a second case experience. For example, there might be a loss of eye contact. You might turn the eyes off and look way off in the distance. There might be a break in the speech pattern, an interruption in the flow of the speech pattern. A switch in verb tensing also can be very indicative, switching from, when I was at the site, it looked like this, it looked like this. And there's a pause, and he says, the site is, the site has, it is running along. So we're switching from a past tense kind of debriefing mode to a present tense mode. And that's a very interesting micro-behavior to tell the monitor that's watching this whether the person is involved in a first-person case or a second-person case. Sometimes a slowing down of the rhythm of the verbalization, just a slowing down in the speech pattern, is a really good indication to the fact that the person is in contact with a site. You can think about it sort of in computer terms as co-processing. The proper psychological term for this type of speaking is called scanning speech, where it's as though the individual was searching for words between each word. But this slowing down of the pacing, or the idea of co-processing, is an interesting idea. And by computer co-processing, I mean, let's imagine yourself sitting at your computer and you want to print a document. Well, you notice that while the computer is working on printing, all the other operations on your computer slow down. The screen doesn't refresh quite as well, and the spell checker doesn't come up quite so fast while it's printing, because the computer is doing two things at once, and it's slowing down the operation of the other. Now, of course, that isn't entirely accurate in comparing this to a remote viewing process of slowing down speech, but it gives you the idea of what I'm talking about and how there may be some co-processing going on. The viewer may be accessing the target, describing it, accessing it, describing it, accessing it, describing it. In monitoring and teaching this concept, these things tend to move closer together. You have to watch out for some other things going on. Abstract descriptions are giveaways to second case analytical experiences. For example, a person might begin to describe a site and saying, this is just like the elementary school I went to. It's a brick building and it has a lawn out front. This reminds me exactly of my elementary school. The use of those kinds of similes and conditional judgments are in fact indicators of incorrect, inaccurate remote viewing information. When a person uses those, you know that they've engaged an analysis or a cognitive interpretation, and they've dropped away from the target, dropped away, moving away from their first case experience rather than closer to the first case experience, like the young driver getting more and more practice and eventually being able to talk while they drive. This is a moving away from that. The teacher or the monitor cannot induce words either, because this can slow down that process between first case and second case experience. They have to ask questions in an Ericksonian eliciting style without being directive or without suggesting to the remote viewer perceptions or words to use. As sort of a ridiculous example, the remote viewer might come back and say, a very tall structure in a city. Well, the remote viewer has described all that they know about the target at that point, and it is very inappropriate for the monitor to come back and say, tell me more about the Empire State Building, because they have just introduced a tremendous amount of noise into the system. So you have to use an Ericksonian style, an eliciting sort of this. You might say, in this case, tell me more about this tall structure you're perceiving. Just like the young driver learning to drive and talk at the same time, there's a great need to practice to get these two behaviors, the reporting, objectifying behavior, closer and closer to the first case behavior of awareness. Sometimes it's really hard for people to get these things together rather than separate them further and further. The monitor can be very helpful in promoting the uniting of these two behaviors, the awareness and reporting behavior. During the objectification phase, the interviewer provides, first of all, a sequence of structured moments where the viewer accesses the target. Now, this is done by appropriate questioning by the monitor. He's providing very specific windows for the viewer to access the target and get in contact with the information of interest. Secondly, the structure imposed by the monitor allows for equal units of time for actually objectifying and describing. And so as the remote viewer moves back and forth, shifting back and forth from these two behaviors, they eventually become closer and closer together. If during this process, however, the remote viewer loses contact, the psychic link to the site, many times they can reacquire the site through self-cueing techniques or through monitor cueing. Now remember back when I talked about Pat Price and his glasses? The way he would reacquire the target was just to slip the glasses back on his face. And that was a little behaviorism that learned to be his trigger to do the remote viewing. Ingo's style of putting your pencil down on the paper was a way of triggering access to the target. And for some people, just taking in a big breath and letting it out, a nice big sigh, is a good way to get back on to the target. And also the monitor can cue you back onto the target if you lose it. So what we're trying to do is to get these two behaviors to come back together. This idea of accessing information about the site and then objectifying that information. We want to bring those two behaviors closer and closer together. And the more they become unified, the more accurate the information is, the more accurate the remote viewing. What it all comes down to, however, is the learning process of remote viewing, the teaching, the coaching of remote viewing has to do with setting the stage. The most talented basketball player is never going to blossom unless you take him and put him on the basketball court, let him shoot the ball, put him on a team, challenge him, and hone his skills. Get rid of old habits that they have by praising and reinforcing appropriate behaviors. And it's the same thing with remote viewing. You have to take the remote viewer, the talented remote viewer that's out there in the population, and put him into a situation where he performs as a remote viewer, challenge him, eliminate his old habits by praising and reinforcing beneficial behaviors. The student soon realizes that their perceptions go far beyond those of their physical body. And the implications of that are amazing. Now let's review this concept of military training of remote viewing skills. Back in 1977, I saw remote viewing as a series of behaviors, and I thought that you could train those behaviors using conventional reinforcement techniques. The first of those behaviors was letting go and turning inward. The second was getting in contact with the site itself, sort of a resonance phase. The third behavior is listening to your own internal perceptual processes, simply listening. And the fourth behavior, that of actually becoming aware of information, and aware on all levels. The fifth behavior was describing or objectifying the perceived information, bringing it out of mental space and put it into physical space. In closing, military training was very successful. I was very patriotic about this. My mission was to train remote viewers to assess the impact of hostile intelligence services using remote viewing surveillance against the United States Army. And it was a very successful effort. Later on, these same remote viewers were tasked to conduct intelligence collection missions themselves. During my tour of duty with the unit, I conducted 122 operational missions, consisting of many hundreds of separate remote viewing sessions with a number of individual remote viewers. But due to security restrictions that are still in place, I cannot describe the detailed results of specific operations. According to the official logbook, however, during my tour of duty as the Operations and Training Officer, 47% of the operational projects I conducted were rated by the tasking agencies as being of intelligence value. This was a very successful military operation.